Morning. I'm filling in for Francois today. My name's Jim Gardner. I'm one of the curators here. And I'd like to welcome you to this week's installment of the Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series, sponsored by our Cooperating Society. Thanks, Patty. Today we're happy to host a colleague from the University of Alberta, the province's original university. Dr. Duane Froese is a professor in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences and holds the Canada Research Chair in Northern Environmental Change. Dr. Froese is a world-recognized authority on the Quaternary, which is the most recent interval of time, goes back a couple million years, and includes the Ice Age, the subsequent warming, and saw numerous changes to climate, landscape, flora and fauna, and peopling of the New World. All of those, of course, help contribute to the area in which we live in today. And today, Dr. Froese will talk about work that he's been doing with colleagues in his research lab and at other institutions on the extinction of mammoths, which are mammals, and other large mammals in northern Canada and Alaska, and the curious case of a population of mammoths that survived for several thousands of years longer after mammoths had gone extinct on mainland North America. So, Duane?
Turn this on or anything? Do I have to turn this on, or is that working?
I think it's on.
It's on? Okay, great. All right, well, thanks. This is really a pleasure to have a chance to come here and talk to you about mammoths and Ice Age environments and such. And so really the work that I do is, I would say, strongly interdisciplinary. We work with lots of different people. I'm primarily somebody who's interested in chronology and environmental change. And for me, mammoths, horses, Ice Age mammals are really a wonderful way to sort of both track and understand the sort of cascading effects that happen with environmental change and faunal dynamics. Now, most of you will know about mammoths. They're probably the most iconic of the Ice Age mammals. Most of you will probably know that they went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And probably several of you, or many of you, will have your own theories as to why they went extinct or your own preference. So I'm going to guess here. How many of you think it was humans that hunted them to extinction? Nobody? Got it. Okay, there's one there. Anybody else? That's probably the leading hypothesis. That's the one that, when you talk to people, that's the one that they really like. How about environmental change? Oh, look at that. Geez, you're a clever bunch. All right. Then there's other things. There's a bolide hypothesis about an impact event that happened about 13,000 years ago. Anybody know about this? No? Okay. There's another one, hyperdisease. The idea that there was sort of this trans-species virus that spread, throughout these animals. This is one that my colleague at the American Museum, Ross McPhee, popularized in the, mid to late 90s. And then there's lots and lots of others that people have proposed. And so we're going to take a look at this. And I think kind of where we're going to get to is we'll start seeing more and more evidence for sort of the individualistic sort of responses of some of these animals to environmental change and some of the pressures that occur. So we'll talk a little bit about the extinction in the Quaternary, some of the hypotheses, the evidence, sort of the traditional view of what do we see from the continents. In this case here, we're going to look at northwestern North America, Yukon, Alaska, the unglaciated area of North America that's connected to Eurasia via the Bering Land Bridge. And in particular, looking at the fossils and the relationship between the environmental change in some of those fossils. Using molecular fossils, that was sort of a thing that we started about almost a decade ago, looking for cryptic refugia, and what do they potentially tell us? It's a more controversial kind of view of the world. And then ultimately, island populations on St. Paul Island off the coast of Alaska, which is a project that we just finished up here about a year or so ago, which has a very late surviving population until about 6,000 years ago. Okay, so what's unique about this part of the world? What's unique about the Quaternary? So unlike sort of other areas of paleontology, there's a few things that we have to our advantage with the Quaternary that I think makes understanding and studying Quaternary mammals really an interesting proposition. Firstly, the fossils tend to be very well preserved. We can collect lots and lots of fossils very quickly, often in detrital contexts, which in many sort of areas, as we go deeper back into the geologic record, those fossils perhaps don't have as much value. But because of radiocarbon dating, that we can take any individual fossil, if we have the resources, we can extract collagen. We really understand a lot of the pitfalls in dating. We can look at the collagen and long chains, and we can look at single amino acids, and we can do all kinds of things to give us confidence that we're actually accurately dating that individual fossil to put it into a time stratigraphic framework to understand how it fits into this kind of global picture of what was going on. And we can do this pretty well for the last 40,000 years. Some people would argue 50,000 years, but I would say probably the last 30,000 years we can get really, really good precision and accuracy. We can get to less than 1% error on most of these ages. We have exceptional preservation. This is particularly true in the part of the world that I work in, where we have permafrost, and you're going to have Grant Zazula, one of my colleagues, come in and give you, that's actually not Grant, but this is permafrost preservation, and talk about some of the ancient biomolecules, including ancient DNA and proteins and things like this. And so this allows us to do things with this part of the record that we can't do with deeper parts of the geologic record, although there's some really interesting new work with proteins. Excellent paleoenvironmental data. Because we have a fairly complete geologic record from this time frame, we can, with some really great sites, we can learn a lot about how the environment changed, when it changed, and we can get very specific time sort of chronologies on this for the last 40,000 years or so. And these properties taken together, because we only have one Earth we can work with, allow us to interrogate some of these linkages between the environment and with the faunal dynamics. And that's kind of what I'll sort of paint a picture for today. Okay, so in the North American Arctic, we lost roughly 2/3 of the megafauna sometime around 10, 11, maybe 13,000 years ago. We were left with just a few caribou, bears, muskox, some sheep, caribou, and this guy here, bison. Well, this is actually latifrons, but kind of its relative, Priscus, which is the steppe bison that persisted in northern Canada until just maybe a few hundred years ago, and finally went extinct and was left with the southern plains bison. And so when we start looking at this, the sort of hypotheses, this comes from Tony Barnowski's summary, but we can see that in different parts of the world, people have implicated humans. Australia or South America, places like Australia, where humans have potentially been implicated within this. In North America, the role of humans, potentially climate in different parts of that record. And so there's sort of this sort of conventional view that we've lost roughly 2/3 of the large mammals sometime between 50 and maybe about 10,000 years ago or so. The main hypotheses we already talked about: climate, human hunting, blitzkrieg, hyperdisease, meteor impact, the keystone herbivore, all these different hypotheses to explain this sort of cascading effect. North America plays an important role in this because we can constrain the colonization pretty well. We know when humans showed up in fairly good detail. We know that there's a fairly well-developed database, both of dated fossils and environmental records, which other parts of the Arctic and Siberia, we don't have perhaps quite as rich a record as we do for this part of the world that we can use to draw some of these inferences. So this is the part of the world that we're talking about. So this is Beringia. So this is the area to the east of the Bering Land Bridge. So this green area here is what the Bering Land Bridge would have looked like about 18,000 years ago when we had globally lowered sea level. This is the Laurentide ice sheet, part of the ice sheet that covered here in the Drumheller area, way down here somewhere. The Cordilleran ice sheet, and then this unglaciated or largely non-glaciated area of the Yukon and Alaska that was sufficiently cold to support ice sheets, but it was too dry. So we really were starved for moisture in order to feed these ice sheets. And so this area stayed unglaciated or non-glaciated through the last 2.5, 3 million years. And so it has a really rich record of sedimentation. It is preserved mostly with permafrost, so we can look at relict conditions and environmental records that go back, in some cases, more than 700,000 years that have been frozen since the time that those sediments were laid down and those fossils were incorporated within some of those sedimentary records. It was very dry, and as a result, it had this sort of grassland environment that supported this grazing megafauna that included mammoths and horses and bison. And it was connected across the Bering Land Bridge to Chukotka and Eurasia. One of the sites that I'll tell you about today, just to kind of put it into context, is this little bit of islands down here. These are the Pribilof Islands, which St. Paul Island that I'll tell you about is here. So we're about 300 or 400 kilometers west of Anchorage there. And I'll tell you a little bit about this area here, the Klondike Goldfields, which is an area that I've been going back to work in for more than 20 years now. A little bit about some stuff here in Alaska, in northern Yukon. And then a site way over here in the interior of Alaska called Stevens Village. And I'm going to sort of put together a picture of about 3 studies that we've looked at mammoth and mammoth extinction to try to understand what collectively we've learned about the dynamics of the extinction and extirpation of mammoths across northern Canada and Alaska towards the end of the Pleistocene and the early Holocene. Okay, so these are the characteristic fauna. This is the steppe bison. This is bison priscus. This is the same bison we had here in the Drumheller area in the late Pleistocene. It's ancestral to all modern bison, including the woodland bison. Oops. And the plains bison. This is the late Pleistocene horse, Equus lame, which is a small Ice Age horse that was found across the north and into Eurasia. A fossil of one of these, actually a mummy of one of these, was recovered from permafrost in the Klondike by Dick Harrington, or Dick Harrington was involved with it. And one of the interesting things from that was the mane was preserved. And so instead of looking like what we thought, Przewalski's horse from the steppes of Asia with these very short manes, because of the permafrost preservation, we could see that there was aspects within the soft tissue and the hair and the tail that was preserved to tell us more about the look of this horse than we would have known otherwise, including the stomach of this horse and the contents of the stomach to tell us what these horses were eating, which was mostly a diet of grasses and forbs. This is Mammoth, which is the one that really stands out and sort of captures a lot of our attention. The bones are really big, well preserved, and they don't tend to get missed too often. This comes out of a placer gold mining exposure in the Klondike. Okay. So taking a look, first of all, at continental extinction. So what do we know about continental extinction? Sort of the conventional view of what are the fossils, what are the dates on the fossils, when does the last dated fossil actually occur? Okay. So this is from northern Yukon, a place that we've done a lot of work called Old Crow, the Old Crow Flats in northern Yukon in the Vuntut-Gwich'in traditional territory. And there, this is one of the richest faunal sites. You can see lots and lots of examples here of mammoth teeth. It's actually a sand-bedded river, and so the coarsest material this river transports is actually mammoth. And so the heads of lots of these bars are clusters and clusters of mammoth bones. This little pile of bones here took 4 of us the better part of 2 hours to sort of pile bones in a 20 meter by 20 meter area, just to kind of put them in stacks, ultimately to bag them and take them back. Lots of horses and horse fossils through here, lots of broken bits of mammoth through here. And so ultimately, if you collect these fossils from enough places, and you have the resources, and you can extract the collagen, and you can radiocarbon date that, you can look at the dates on these things. It's an expensive endeavor, because a lot of these fossils are beyond our radiocarbon range, but there's nothing, in most cases, once we get into the typical late Pleistocene fauna, there's nothing that really tells us the age of the fossils because they typically are so well preserved, and so you need to use a lot of resources in order to date them to do that, and that's kind of limited by money for the most part. When we look at the sort of total picture of fossils here from Yukon and Alaska, this is kind of not the most complete summary, but the picture hasn't really changed much. What we see when we look at the dates, radiocarbon dates on mammoths, so this is the last 18 to 9,000 years. This is mammoths here, horses, equus, bison, cervids, wapiti or elk, moose, and humans. We're going to look mostly here. So you can see mammoths. We get lots of mammoths, 18, 17, 16, 15. And then about 11,500 radiocarbon years ago, which is about 13,000 calendar years, or our years, because the radiocarbon and the calendar timescale start to diverge just a little bit as we go back in time. We can see about 11,500 radiocarbon years, or 13,000 years ago, the mammoths are gone. Horses, more or less a similar story. They kind of persist through the last glacial maximum when the ice sheets are at their maximum. We now have a few more dates around this port here, but that sort of shows that timing. Bison are actually pretty sparse through the full glacial time when we have just this really sparse grassland kind of environment. But then they really explode as things start to warm in the latest Pleistocene, and bison really take off. And then they sort of decline and sort of persist through the Holocene in northern Canada. Elk are interesting because elk are not there. They come across the Bering Land Bridge, and then they just explode in numbers, and then they persist through much of the Holocene, and then they disappear later. And then moose. Moose is probably the most interesting one because moose, again, comes across from the Bering Land Bridge, and it sort of appears about 12,500 years ago, and then it persists and does really well through the Holocene in northern Canada. So if we look at just the timing of that extinction, for the most part in the north, the big three, and sort of the mammoth and horses in particular, disappear around 11,500 years ago, and that's our sort of last occurrence datum. There is the possibility of ghost ranges, the Signer-Lipps effect, the idea here that even though we may recover lots of fossils and date lots of fossils, the chances that we're actually going to recover the last member of any of these taxa and actually then choose to use our resources and date that fossil to accurately date the timing of that extinction is actually a fairly small proposition. We have to sort of assume that there's some bias between the estimates that we get from this approach and the final occurrence of a particular taxon, right? It's a pretty reasonable thing. We don't know the magnitude of that bias. We don't know how much that bias is. So I think most of us would look at these sorts of data sets and say that, well, this is probably the period of catastrophic losses. This is the period where most of these fauna probably disappeared, and we may have had small numbers persist, but we haven't had the opportunity to actually find and date those fossils. Or at least they're probably in collections, but we haven't used our resources to pick those fossils and actually put the resources into dating those fossils. And that's a pretty likely scenario. So when we start to look at some of the dates, we can look at them in histograms and things. I'll just show you one other way that we look at these dates, because every radiocarbon date is actually a probability distribution. This is almost the most technical part of the talk. And so what we can do is we can take the probability distributions of lots of individual radiocarbon dates, and we can sum them together to try to look at sort of relative likelihood of dates over time. And this starts to become in what is called calendar years or calibrated years before present. So these are our years. And so that we have that little bit of a divergence here. And so I'm just going to show you these dates again here in a second. In that sort of view of things, so when we look at mammoths, we can see the mammoth dates up here, and we can see the calibrated range here about 13,000 years ago or so. Horses, again, the dates here, the calibrated ranges here, 14,000. We now have a few more that kind of go down to about this point here, which is the same period of when mammoths disappear. Moose here, Alsace, we can see that they show up right about the time that mammoths and horses are disappearing in the north. And then they disappear when we have this little cold reversal here. It's called the Younger Dryas, where we kind of go back into glacial conditions. And this is sort of the period where shrubs start to take off, and I'll show you that in just a second. And so if you're a moose and you go from this grassland environment to shrubs and woodland sort of environment, it's a good time to be a moose. Not such a great time to be a mammoth. Okay, we'll come back to that point here in just a second. And bison really take off as we start to warm, kind of going into the late Pleistocene. So if we just start back to the hypotheses of extinction and the overkill hypothesis, the faunal turnover that occurs, so the disappearance of mammoths and horses, these grazers being replaced by browsers like moose and cervids like wapiti, is problematic for the overkill. So that this group of people are out there hunting, and they decide to hunt horses and mammoths to extinction, but they are not interested in hunting, say, elk, and they're not interested in hunting moose to extinction at the same time, right? So we'll come back to that in a second here. So this is what a lot of our deposits look like in northern Canada. These are called mucks by the gold miners. They're essentially wind-blown silts, dust deposits that have accumulated, and as they've accumulated, the permafrost has built up with that. We can see some ice bodies. This is relic ice here, so meaning ice that's been there and been frozen since it was deposited. This one here has a really nice volcanic ash in it. In this case here, it's about 80,000 years old. It has lots of nice plant materials that are preserved, have been frozen since the time that stuff was deposited. And we can, if we're lucky to get fossils out of this stuff, that's great. But one of the really nice things is this organic matter here is tremendously well preserved. Anything out of that stuff is tremendously well preserved. The proteins, the collagen, all of this stuff that's in those fossils is tremendously well preserved, including things like DNA from these fossils. Okay. So this comes from some work that we've done through here, and we can sort of see that there's changes in the environment over time. This is the last 50,000 years that we're going to look at. And what we see is we go from a period from about 50,000 to about 30-odd thousand years ago. We sort of have open boreal kind of conditions with tundra. So it's colder than today, but not as cold as the full glacial. And then about 30,000 years ago, it starts to really get cold. And these are isotopes out of the Klondike, out of permafrost. We get values here really, really depleted. To get values of minus 30 per mil in oxygen today, you'd have to go to the high Arctic, so a place like Alert, northern Ellesmere and places. And we change our vegetation to steppe tundra. This means it's a grassland environment for the most part. It's too dry and too cold to support trees. So it's a dry, cold place. If you're a mammoth, you're a horse, this is a good time for you. And then about 14,000 years ago, it starts to warm rapidly, and the shrubs start to expand. We get sort of shrub tundra, ultimately to shrubs, and then boreal forest comes in the subarctic. And then we get sort of our Holocene conditions, and it stays pretty dull through the Holocene here. And we can see that within the deposits themselves, they start to change. We get thawing of permafrost events. We have ice wedges. We have lots of wind-blown silts through here. Lots of Arctic ground squirrels, things like that sort of record these conditions. When we look at the fossils, we can look at the horse fossils. This is out of the Klondike. We've dated about 150 of them out of the Klondike goldfields. We can see that bison are really prominent here in this period here where we have open canopy tundra. They disappear for the most part as the grasslands expand. This was a bit of a surprise to us. If we had more dates, we could probably fill in this part through here because we know they're in Alaska and we know they're elsewhere in the Yukon at this time. Horses are very sparse through this time, but when it gets really dry and cold and very grassland sort of rich environment, the horses really become the most common fossils that we recover from that time interval. So we start to see partitioning of what the fauna are based on the environment over time. Okay. This is the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. This is the end of the Pleistocene where things kind of go to hell for a lot of animals, and we get this major reorganization of ecosystems. We go from these dry, wind-blown silts with Arctic ground squirrels and essentially prairie dog kind of sort of conditions. So imagine you're here in the southern plains here, grassland environment. And then right about here, you can see peat starts to show up and shrubs and organic rich material. We got 7 or 8 meters of that stuff that accumulates here over about 6,000 to 7,000 years. So this is the big transition that occurs, and we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at what exactly happened across that transition to try to understand what happened to mammoths on the mainland. Jump ahead. This is that transition here, and you can see there's a nice soil here that's preserved, all frozen in time here in permafrost, and then lots and lots of woody macrofossils start to show up and shrubs start to show up. This is what it looks like up close. And it turns out that between about 13,100 and 13,200, we go from dry tundra and steppe tundra conditions, so dry grassland environments, to lots and lots of shrubs, mostly birch and salix. And in fact, that transition, the radiocarbon dates across that transition are more or less the same. And you can play games with statistics and things, but it looks like essentially we have that transition happening in perhaps as little as 20 or 30 years. We quickly go from a grassland environment to a shrub sort of woodland environment over a period of perhaps on the order of decades. Okay? We've looked at the fossil insects across that transition, and what we see at the base here, we see that we have some of the beetles through here, indicators of one in particular. It's called Conchitalia artemisia, and it's a weevil, that lives on the flowers of prairie sage, Artemisia frigida. So when you have Artemisia frigida, prairie sage, an excellent indicator of steppe, deep active layers, grassland environment, kinds of stuff you're going to find around here in these grassland environments. And then we go into indicators of more wetland sort of environments and mesic sort of zones, and then we go into boreal zones. And we see that transition across that boundary, very rapid transition that we see both in terms of the soils and in terms of the insects across that boundary, which tell us quite a bit. This comes from Svetlana Kuzmina, who was a postdoc with me for quite a while, working on fossil insects in Ice Age environments. And the interesting thing when we look at the faunal part, this is the faunal part, these radiocarbon dates here for horses, for example, and for mammoths here. And this is that transition through here. We essentially see that the mammoths and horses are disappearing as the shrubs are expanding. So if you're a mammoth, you're a horse, you're making a living on grasslands, and the grasslands disappear and the shrubs start to appear, if you happen to be a moose, or if you happen to be even elk and bison, you're going to do a lot better as this faunal turnover event occurs. Okay. And what do we think happened? This is probably our best analog for it, things that are going on in the Arctic today with the transition and the greening of the Arctic and the tundra essentially transitioning with the expansion of shrubs today. This is a period here of, 13 and 23, so about 20, 30 years or so. Some sites here on Herschel Island, northern Yukon, and the expansion of shrubs across this. And this is a process that's been going on across the Arctic with the greening of the Arctic and the expansion of tree line as temperatures have been warming and wetting has been occurring across the circumarctic. We think, our kind of view of this is that really this is the period of catastrophic losses where this grazing megafauna really disappeared and we started to replace it with sort of more gregarious sort of feeders, animals like bison and moose in particular across the north. Okay, so let's take a look at cryptic refugia. The idea that we have these persistence of populations that may have not left necessarily an easy to find fossil record, but we may have their persistence that we might be able to find other ways from the geologic record. Okay, this is a bit of a controversial thing. We published this, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, something like that. And it comes from this sort of area of modern biology, and this is for Jim. We have a frog here for him. It comes from this area of environmental DNA and the way that biologists track cryptic refugia. And the idea is that you don't necessarily have to have the animal or the skeleton because animals leave traces of DNA everywhere they go. And so, for example, the invasion of this bullfrog into Western Europe, rather than going and electroshocking ponds to try to find them, what they do now is they go and they take essentially 50 milliliters of water from a pond, they sequence the DNA, and they look for this particular bullfrog to see if it's present. And it turns out this is a better and more effective and cheaper way to map the expansion of this invasive species. This is a guy here named Eske Willerslev, who's a professor at Copenhagen and now at Cambridge. And so in about 2003 or so, we were doing joint field work together. And he was just finishing his PhD. We were doing work in the Yukon. And he published this paper looking at permafrost and essentially looking at the DNA from permafrost. And he showed that you could actually recover plants and animals from frozen sediments. We didn't know an awful lot about what the biases were. We still actually don't know a lot about what the biases are. But it was really a revelation that you could essentially take a few grams of sediment, put it in a buffer, extract DNA from that, sequence that DNA, and look at some of the plants, some of the animals. Most everything you look at is going to be microbial, but there are plants and animals that may be of interest. The technology has moved along rapidly. And so when we were doing field work, this paper was just was coming out maybe that fall or something like that after we were doing our field work. And I said to Eske that, we've got this really great site in Alaska. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could look at this whole series of soils that date from about 10,000 years ago to about 7,000 years ago and look at the faunal turnover from the sediments? So could we actually see the timing of extinction, the disappearance of mammoths, horses, the appearance of moose, elk within a sedimentary record? Could we actually maybe look at this somewhat more controversially where we don't actually have the physical fossils, but we have molecular fossils that we may be able to work with. Okay. And so the basic premise is that an animal has essentially one skeleton to give up that might be preserved, if you're lucky, in the geologic record. But the whole time that animal is living, it's shedding DNA in the landscape, maybe in the form of feces, hair. For example, a modern elephant will urinate in excess of 50 liters of water a day, again, full of DNA. And so the whole time these sort of ecological agents are moving through the environment, they're essentially shedding this ecological dandruff into the environment that, if we're lucky and we can develop the techniques, we could actually recover this. So we tried to use this in a place in Alaska called Stevens Village. And it's in the west end of the Yukon Flats, right more or less in the middle of the Yukon of Alaska, right where the Yukon River starts to make its turn back down to the south before heading out to the Bering Strait. And essentially there's an exposure here called Stevens Village that I had worked on back in my PhD. And essentially northern winds, when it gets cold, essentially northern winds throw dust off of the floodplain of the Yukon River onto the southern end of the Yukon Flats. And this happened right across the Pleistocene-Holocene transition from about 11,000 years ago or so until about 7,000 years ago or so. And a whole series of very nicely developed and well-expressed soils are present, and all of it frozen in permafrost. So excellent preservation of the material. This is what the site looks like. We did lots of big cliffs within this and holes within this to try to get in and back to frozen material, to essentially drill out frozen material. And what we found was that when we get back into the 10, 11,000 years here, we've got some rabbits and things, and we've got some moose and bison. But then we were still getting mammoth and horse DNA up until about 7,000 years ago. And, you know, this got a little bit of a rough ride, and we thought it was controversial. And initially, we were going to publish this just in one of our Quaternary journals, but my colleague had an idea for kind of getting this into another journal, and we did. And it's been reasonably well cited because it's the first sort of paper that tried to look at this potentially application that we'll kind of talk about here in just a second. But as you can imagine, you know, what is the possibility that we could take ancient DNA or older DNA and rework it within these deposits to essentially get false positives, like we would if, say, an older fossil gets reworked into younger materials, right? So this was a problem, and we had to deal with that a little bit through the review process. And so we did fairly extensive studyings of modern environments and point bars and little thaw ponds on the landscape. And everywhere we looked, we were looking for this signal of ancient DNA of mammoths and horses and things within the modern environment. We could never find it. So, you know, a lack of evidence isn't necessarily evidence, but it at least passed the tests repeatedly that we could put forward for it. So I'd say it's still controversial, but what it would suggest is that we may have had cryptic refugia here persisting to perhaps 7,000, 8,000 years ago in this area of Alaska. Another one of the tests, we knew genetically that it was a particular group, clade 4, for these last surviving mammoths. It was the right group of mammoths. It wasn't an older mammoth DNA that was there and things like this. We did a lot of experiments with DNA and UV light, trying to look at how DNA can survive in the environment and things, and ultimately convinced ourselves that we probably have this picture. And I think the coexistence of some of the extant and extinct species DNA was one of the interesting aspects of that. Okay, so this was published maybe 2008, 2009, something like that. Techniques have moved along a lot since that time. We could do this quite differently now if we were to redo it. And in a way, we did sort of redo part of this, looking at one of the late surviving populations off the coast of Alaska, one of these island populations where mammoths persisted very late. All right, now I'll walk you through this figure because it looks more complicated than it is. So this is a map, a phylogeographic map of mammoths where we have mitochondrial genomes, or the authors have mitochondrial genomes, to essentially look at the structure of these different, if you like, herds or clades of mammoths. And so prior to about 40-odd thousand years ago, we had a lot of diversity across the Arctic. We had this group that was occupying Western Europe and right onto the border of Eurasia. We had another group that was occupying parts of Siberia and down into areas of China and Tibet. And then we had this group that was mostly in North America and in the eastern part of Eurasia. So we actually had quite a bit of diversity amongst mammoths at that time. That's probably not surprising because we're mixing a lot of ages of stuff together that are giving us that, because we're at this sort of time interval of 40-odd thousand years where it's really, really hard to know precisely the age of a fossil, because we're more or less at the end of the radiocarbon timescale. So we're probably seeing more diversity there than we would have if we had a narrower time interval to look at. All right. Then when we look at this period from about 30-odd thousand to 45,000, we can see that we've lost one group of mammoths. We've left this North American group for the most part. And then up till about 24,000 years ago, ultimately this European group goes out, and this group that essentially started in North America becomes the only group of mammoths left. And then as we get even younger, we can see just a few groups are left. There's this group here. Well, there's actually a group over here in the Taimyr Peninsula in Siberia that persists till about 9,500 years ago. That's the youngest of a mainland population. And then there's this group here that many of you may have heard of on Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia, where a group of mammoths persisted till almost 4,000 years ago, or actually a little younger than 4,000 years ago. So you can imagine people in ancient Egypt could potentially have come and seen mammoths and overlapped with mammoths, maybe taken them home as pets. And then there's this group here on St. Paul Island and the Pribilof Islands here off the coast of Alaska. And both of these ones are interesting because on Wrangel Island and the Pribilofs, these were both essentially high spots on the Bering Land Bridge. And when sea level rose at the end of the Pleistocene, these became islands. And these mammoths that would have been on the Bering Land Bridge ultimately had to move to higher ground and were isolated on these islands. Wrangel Island is interesting because there's not really an archaeological record till maybe 4,000 years ago or so, and there's some suggestions that people showed up at about that time, and that's sort of the kind of going hypothesis for why that population may have gone extinct. St. Paul here has no record of human presence until the Russians show up there in the late 18th century. And they show up there to ultimately start harvesting fur seals. Okay? This is what St. Paul looks like. It's kind of a, you essentially fly from Anchorage here for about 3 or 4 hours to out here to the Pribilofs. It's famous today because there's this television show, Alaska's Deadliest Catch, which films out of there regularly, where they catch halibut and king crab. You have to convince yourself as you get on a plane that seems far too small to fly out over the Bering Strait that this is a good idea. And this is the target. And you have to have enough fuel in the plane because often it's so cloud covered that essentially they get out there and they have to turn around and go all the way back because they can't land on the island. We got lucky there on a nice clear day. This is what St. Paul looks like. It's an interesting place because it's largely settled by Aleuts who were moved there somewhat forcibly by Russian fur traders in the late 18th, early 19th century, ultimately to harvest seals. So it's got this group of largely Aleut folks with Russian-sounding names, Russian Orthodox churches and things out there. And it's a really big destination for birders because it has this very unusual group of Asian and North American birds that show up there in the Bering Strait. This is what the island looks like to give you a sense of scale. That's the airport, and that's the runway for the airport. So the whole island is on the order of maybe 100 square kilometers. And so we spent part of the summer of 2013 there. Essentially, we walked pretty much all of the coast everywhere looking for fossils because mammoth fossils every once in a while show up. And we cored a lake up here on one of these young volcanoes in the winter of 2012-13 for our studies. And then ultimately tried to put this together to try to look at what was going on in the Pribilofs with this late surviving mammoth population. This was the field vehicle here driving around on the Pribilofs, our group. So it was a very interdisciplinary group of folks from all over Europe and North America that were out there and looking at a lot of different proxies. And so on a nice day, it's sort of, you can imagine you're sort of with these red soils, you're in Hawaii, but most of the days are kind of look a little bit like that. A little cloudier, lots of seals along the coast. And prior to humans showing up there, there was really, the the mammoth, or the mammal population consisted of an Arctic fox and a shrew and marine mammals. And then the Russians and the Americans in the early 1900s introduced caribou in the island in 1912, so I should say the Americans did. And that was pretty much the large mammal population for the area. You can get an idea how wet the place is. The mosses growing on some of the rocks here along the coast. Most days are really cloudy, really wet. So you can imagine sort of coastal grasslands, very cloudy. You could expect that you would have trees there if you had more sunny days, more warmer sort of summer temperatures that are really precluded by the amount of fog. So it's a very lush mixture of forbs and grasses. So you can imagine if you're a mammoth, this is probably a pretty good place to make a living. We can estimate based on modern elephant populations that there may have been a density of maybe on the order of a couple dozen, maybe 3 dozen mammoths living on this island through much of the Holocene. This is the lake. This is Hill Lake, it's called. It's relatively shallow. It's a volcano. It's essentially a crater lake. The edges of it are essentially scoria, sort of like kind of a coarse, granular kind of lava that's essentially been spit out of the volcano. It's very easily erodible, and we'll come back to that. There's some gas escape structures along the edges of it. The volcano itself is probably on the order of 50, maybe 100,000 years old, and the lake sediments here that we cored give us a record of some of that. And this is what some of the place looks like, the Arctic foxes, the caribou. The caribou are interesting because they were introduced in 1912, a couple dozen individuals. They popped up by the 1950s into almost 2,000 caribou, and by the late 1950s there were 12. And essentially winter kill essentially led to the big population crash of the caribou on the island. And they've done better now. There's perhaps on the order of a few hundred caribou now there today. And mammoths. So mammoths were there. We were interested because in the early 2000s, Dale Guthrie, who is a paleobiologist at the University of Alaska, had dated a tooth from St. Paul, and he dated to about 7,500, 8,000 radiocarbon years, so about 9,000 years ago or so. And we were interested, is that really the timing of extinction? What happened? How late did this population survive? And what could we learn about the process of extinction on this island? So this was the main site that recovered fossils. This is essentially a lava tube, and there's what you'd consider to be a pit cave here, or this lava tube. And this ladder going down here, this is Russ Graham, who's at Penn State, who is the leader who wrote the NSF proposal to fund us to go there. This is what it looks like inside. And essentially unsuspecting mammoths, lots of Arctic foxes, every once in a while fall into this thing and leave behind a fossil record within the cave that we were able to excavate, recover some mammoth from that, and then some mammoth remains from some of the coastal exposures and some of the beaches. A lot of it pretty beaten up looking stuff. Interesting, there was a bear there that persisted maybe till 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. There was a wolf there as well that came from there. So we started to find out a little bit more about the faunal community that existed there. And ultimately, the last dated fossil from Guthrie, about 8,000, what drove extinction? So the question is this an accurate last occurrence datum? Is this really the time that this population went extinct? No human presence, so we could essentially remove that potential agent here of humans hunting these animals to extinction, or at least we thought we could. Relatively stable climate through the Holocene in this part of the world. The ice core records in southern Alaska and Yukon suggest that things are pretty stable. Lake records suggest things are pretty stable. Maybe there's a bit of aridity sort of showing up in the mid-Holocene. But really an ideal place to sort of test the process of extinction using a multi-proxy approach, and in fact using this sort of molecular sort of paleontological sort of technique within the lake sediments. Okay, so this is what the island looked like about 13,000 years ago. It became isolated from the mainland. The volcanoes here essentially were the high spots. These would have been essentially mountains of the Bering Land Bridge. About 6,500 years ago, essentially the island, sea level was about where it is today. The island is about its present size. And then humans show up here in the late 18th century. This is coring of the lake off ice a few years ago. And then ultimately, a multi-proxy kind of approach with a whole group of collaborators looking at some of the plant macrofossils, the pollen, the coprophilous fungal spores. So these are essentially spores that live on feces on the landscape. They tend to be very well preserved. And they've been used quite effectively in lake sediment records in the US Midwest, looking at, and in New York State, looking at extinction of mastodons, for example, in that part of the world, based on essentially the abundance of these coprophilous fungi, these spores that are present within lake sediments. And so we were interested in that to try to look at this process of extinction. Quaternary, some of the bugs living in the lake, oxygen isotopes to try to look at some of the water balance, and that's coming from some of the chitin from some of the Daphnia and things that are living in the lake, the diatom, some nitrogen isotopes, sedimentary magnetism to track sedimentation within the lake. This is what the sampling looks like within the lake sediments here. And essentially you had about I think it was about a 6-8 meter core that covered the Holocene, the last 10,000 years or so, and back into the late Pleistocene. And so this is the big summary figure from that paper and that study. And essentially we see a couple things that are really important. I'm going to start off down here with the magnetic susceptibility. So this is 11,000 years ago or so. This is present over here on this end. And what we see is that there's fairly high magnetic susceptibility. All that means is there's lots of coarse sediment coming off of the edges of the lake into the lake. And so we have very rapid sedimentation going on, particularly what picks up again here about 8,000 years ago or so, kind of reaches a maxima, and then it just drops down to just about zero. And we have essentially organic sedimentation, what we call gitcha, essentially organic material, sort of what you might consider pond, sort of mud, the kind of stuff. If you walk out in some of these prairie lakes, you just your kind of sinks between your toes, that kind of stuff going on at about that time. So there's a big change in sedimentation at this time. Okay, we'll look up here. This is the oxygen isotopes. And what we see with the oxygen isotopes is that the lake is getting shallower and shallower, probably as a result of the amount of sediment coming into the lake and the shallowing of the lake. And this really hits a maximum. The big change is happening about 6,000 years ago or so. And this is when the lake is probably similar to today, in the order of maybe a meter to maybe a couple meters deep. Much of that lake today is very, very shallow. Jump ahead here. The dated remains, so these are the dated fossils of mammoth that we have from the island. So we added another 10 or so dates from there. The last dated mammoth is about 5,700 radiocarbon years ago. So a couple thousand years after that last dated mammoth that we had before we started the study. And then there is the DNA. So essentially my colleague at Santa Cruz, Beth Shapiro and her group, essentially looking for mammoth out of the lake sediments using what's called a targeted enrichment. So you're only amplifying DNA from mammoths that you're interested in, and show that you can get mammoth, 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 mammoth. All the green lines represent mammoth, and then the red is no mammoth. And so right there is the period where you get no mammoth, and you get no more mammoth again right through the rest of the Holocene. The coprophilous fungi, so these are the fungal spores that are living on feces. We see lots and lots of them within the lake sediments. And then, boom, they essentially go to zero here. And then they kick up again in about 1912 when caribou were introduced onto the island, which gives us confidence that this approach is probably a pretty good way to track large mammals on this island. Okay, so the lake shallowing from the isotopes, lots of evidence for erosion going on along the shore as animals are probably coming up to this lake to drink. And what we think really ends up happening is we end up with increasing salinity based on the diatoms, so the siliceous algae that are living in the lake, that are recording the environmental conditions within the lake, and increasing turbidity from the Quaternary. Some of the bugs that are living in the lake are telling us that the lake is getting very, very shallow, saline, and turbid at this time, and then it essentially drops off. The turbidity drops off, the salinity drops off at that time. And so what we think is happening is essentially these mammoths are sort of on the Bering Land Bridge. As the island gets smaller, they're getting forced, and then ultimately this becomes the only freshwater source left on the island for these mammoths. So they're essentially coming up to the lake to drink and probably degrading the hill slopes around it, the scoria, these very erodible soils there, that's ultimately shallowing the lake, and decreasing the freshwater availability for this island population. And ultimately, we think it's this freshwater limitation that leads to the extinction of this population, or the extirpation of this population on the island about 5,700 years ago. So I think it's a really nice example of how within the Quaternary, if we have the motivation, we have the resources from the National Science Foundation, we can look at one of these questions of extinction in a lot of detail that we can't do very many other times within the deeper time geologic record. And in fact, this really hasn't been done very much, even within the Quaternary record. Okay. So St. Paul, there's really good agreement between the data sets, between the C14 dates on the bones, the fungal spores, the sedimentary DNA from the lake sediments themselves. No evidence for human predation, no obvious climate forcing. Perhaps it's getting a little bit drier based on some lake sediment records around there. But I would argue that we don't even need to do that. We have enough evidence that these mammoths are really essentially degrading the habitat and shallowing the lake, that they probably, to some extent, played a role in their own demise on this island by the degradation of their own habitat around the island. Freshwater limitation, we think, is probably the main driver of the extinction of this island population. Okay. So a couple of the papers from this stuff, what we see is sort of this disappearance of these populations across Alaska, Yukon, probably catastrophic losses around 13,000 years ago or so. Maybe some evidence for cryptic refugia within small areas that might persist a few thousand years later, although we don't have the fossils for that. We have some suggestions from molecular fossils. And then ultimately, where they were isolated, these island populations survived much later when we were removed from the sort of human influence and rapid ecological change. And one of the themes that's really coming out of the Quaternary vertebrate literature is sort of the individualistic responses. So the idea that different taxa are actually responding differently to these environmental stresses, and their population dynamics are really recording their adaptations, their abilities to respond to these environmental changes. Okay. And with that, I'll end. I'll just some acknowledgments of some of the funding and some of the collaborators, because this is really a group effort amongst many of my colleagues that we've worked with for a long time on sort of these multiple projects across northern Canada and Alaska. Thanks.